Hello and what is up, YouTube? My name is G3Iron and welcome to today's discussion where I'll be making 5 different economic predictions for the upcoming 3.12 Heist League. Now, for those of you who are returning veterans of the channel, you know the way how everything around here works. There's more information for anyone that would like to join our Discord down below in the video description. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. You can of course hit like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future video discussions just like this one. Shameless promos aside, let's jump into these 5 predictions. Come on, Morty. Come on, just 10-minute economic discussion. Real quick. Hop in, hop out. The first prediction that I'd like to make is that now that Harvest is gone, or it's not core, at least for the 3.12 cycle, that means that the economy of Heist League is going to look a lot more like the economy of Delirium League of 3.10 than it is going to look like the previous league that we just experienced, 3.11, with Harvest. Harvest League changed the POE trade economy massively, not necessarily in a good way and not necessarily in a bad way. It was simply a change. I'm not making a value statement here, whether or not that was positive or negative on PoE as a whole. I'm simply saying it changed the economy. The fact that players could self-craft their gear and had a different relationship with their currency and with their item bases than they previously have had throughout their gameplay experience in Path of Exile was a big change on the supply and demand interactions of the 3.11 economy, because those particular methods for acquiring gear and then making gear are no longer available, i.e. Harvest isn't here for Heist League. That means that the economy is going to look different. It is going to look much more similar to a time in Path of Exile's history when we have used traditional crafting, traditional known crafting to Path of Exile, rather than using Harvest Garden crafting for making all of our own items. This means if we're going to have any sort of model for predicting what the future is going to hold inside Heist League, we should not necessarily look at Harvest, which was the previous league that we just went through. We shouldn't be looking there because there was so much that was different about how players acquired gear and spent currency. Now that we're going into 3.12 and there's going to be loot explosions and tons of different farmable aspects of heists as content, that is going to make this particular league much more similar to Delirium than it is going to be similar to Harvest. So that's our first prediction. Harvest isn't here. That means that the economy is going to be different. The way how players get gear and craft gear is going to be much more resource intensive in terms of currency, and that is going to, of course, shape the overall interactions that players have in the culture of trade that is Path of Exile. Our second prediction today is that builds that have defensive layers will be very popular in the early stages of Path of Exile Heist. Because Heist has the potential to lose a lot of your rewards should you die after the alarm goes off, that means that a lot of players are going to be focused on staying alive rather than be focused on a whole lot of various offensive mechanics early on in a league. Now, this is a general statement that is true for most league starts, right? At the beginning of almost every league, players are looking for any sort of gear that has got life and resistances on it. Whether that's defeating Katava for the first time in Act 5, defeating Katava for the second time in Act 10, or whether that's simply looking to bolster and overcap your resistances to get to a particular threshold where you no longer have to care about curses. All of that is typically true for a league launch weekend. However, this is going to be amplified in my prediction for Heist because more average players, the average player, not top tier content creators, the 1% who are going to get their currency no matter what and who literally play Path of Exile for a job. Not speaking about those players. I'm speaking about the average player who plays for a few hours here or there, either every day or throughout the week. That average player is going to emphasize survivability because if an average player has a couple of play sessions every single week to play Path of Exile and they make a mistake while they're experiencing their 1 or 2 heists that they get to experience per week, if they make a mistake and lose out on that heist, that is not just lost content for that play session, it might be lost content for a couple of different play sessions. Whereas the pros at the top end, the 1%ers, are going to be able to look at any particular heist and simply say that if they fail it's okay, it's not that big of a loss because they've got it down pat into a rhythm where they're producing heists and producing all sorts of successful contracts on an hourly basis. Now, this means if there's a whole swath of players who are looking to play the game in a more survivable or maybe almost like a labyrinth style mode, not necessarily a hardcore style mode where if you die, then you lose your character, but rather if you die, you reset your instance or you reset your progress a bit or you lose whatever sort of rewards could have been waiting for you there. If that's the way how most average players are going to approach Heist, then that means defensive items, particularly defensive uniques, are going to be particularly valuable to sell. It doesn't necessarily mean that simply because you find an Omnivorax or you find a Comb's Heart that you're going to be rich and that's going to pay for the rest of your build for the league. But it might mean that prices on those various types of various uniques that are used, that are more defensive oriented, that are maybe not necessarily niche for any particular build, but can be generalized for life builds, say in Comb's Heart, or generalized for a build that wants to stack energy shield like a Chevron's Wrapping. Those sorts of different uniques are probably going to be up in price from where they have been both in Harvest League, but also following the logic of our first prediction, higher even than where we were at with Delirium League. We saw this a little bit in Delirium League, that players were scared to lose out on the fog. As they were interacting with each particular map, players needed to come to a balance between survivability, being able to actually take a hit once they're inside the fog, but also having the damage to be able to kill and clear monsters inside the fog in the instances of Delirium. We've got something similar going on here with Heist. You need to be able to clear out the monsters as you're on your way to capture an artifact or steal an artifact, and then you need to be able to survive and get out and kill whatever is in your way, hopefully, as you are retrieving the artifact and making your grand escape. Far more often, players in the average category, not players in the 1%. And I can already hear some of you down below in the comments saying with your Kermit masks on, oh, but Iron, the 1%ers, they're going to set the meta for the entire league, and they're going to be all the zoom fast DPS builds. Yes, that's true, but we've already said, remember, the content producers and the top 1%, they're going to be 1% and doing whatever it is that they want to do because they've got the currency available to them, and they've got the time to put into the game that nobody else does. So for the average player, that's who we're talking about here, the average player who is looking to buy and trade on a daily basis using POE trade, those are the people who are going to be looking at these various uniques and picking them up for a few extra chaos than what they might otherwise be worth. Now, all of that is, of course, contingent on timing inside the league. Now, this is true for the first week to about 4 weeks of any given league, that there are lots of different builds that are out there and players are still building and filling out their starter builds until there is a dominant meta that takes shape. Typically, that meta takes shape between week 2 and week 4. If you're interested in studying and learning more about the meta, don't worry, we've got that covered every single league. We typically cover both the economic meta as well as the player build meta throughout those first 4 weeks of each league. So don't worry, we'll do our best to keep you up to date. But while that meta is actually forming and players are making decisions about what builds are going to be the most optimal for tackling Heist content, that is where players can make some currency because a lot of players, those average players, are looking for defensive layer-based items and defensive layering on the tree. If you can provide a healthy supply of defensive options to those average players, then you can expect to be making a bit of extra currency. Our third prediction for Heist League and its economy is that experimental bases will be, for the most part, disregarded. In other words, in terms of their economic value, most experimental bases are simply going to be what many refer to as vendor trash. The new arrival of bases is a really cool and exciting idea. Conceptually, it's something I'm very excited for in the 3.12 Heist patch. I'm very excited to see if there's any builds that I'm planning on playing that are going to be affected, if there's anything that's going to be boosted, or rather the floor is brought up, as it were, for a lot of different players that already had maybe something as a best in slot item. And maybe now with these experimental base types, maybe there's a new best in slot sort of item that can be crafted. While that's the top end and that's the hope of experimental bases, the reality is that most builds already have in mind something that is going to be most optimal for them. So the experimental bases that might have a different implicit or that might have some sort of niche use are going to be just that. They're going to be operating and best used for a subset of a particular type of build. They're not going to be as cookie cutter friendly as what a lot of the meta is in Path of Exile, where players are simply looking at Path of Buildings or at build guides and saying, what item am I supposed to put into this slot? Experimental bases will in fact pick up in their price, however, as that dominant meta starts to emerge throughout the first 2 to 4 weeks of Heist League, as players actually establish which builds are going to be top tier for taking on Heist content. That is where we are going to begin to see whether players can use experimental bases as a best in slot item or not. So expect early on these bases to be somewhat ho-hum and not necessarily moving very quickly on the market, but then as a meta emerges, some of these experimental base types are going to become very, very valuable, and the rest of them are going to remain what they always were from the get-go, which is pretty much vendor trash. Prediction number 4 is that Magic Find is back on the menu for 3.12 Heist League. We've got an entirely new item slot called Trinkets, and this is going to allow us to add further layers onto our Magic Find. This means that anybody who was already using Magic Find and really wanted to target farm something is now going to have added incentive for doing so. And anybody in general who wanted to have some additional loot drop is going to have an item slot dedicated for that purpose. In other words, players who wanted to take advantage of item quantity or item rarity are definitely going to be reaping the benefits by far of this new item slot having trinkets. If you want to target farm contracts and simply live inside your heist and take advantage of your trinket bonuses for Magic Find, you're going to be able to do that. And as you do that, you're going to be making all sorts of extra cash thanks to the various trinkets that are going to be available in 3.12 Heist League. While not many players know about item rarity is totally a legitimate strategy, especially in the first couple of weeks of the league. Unique items are oftentimes at their highest price point early on in a league in terms of value, so players who can stack item rarity early on and get a wide variety of different uniques to then sell out to other players who are needing those uniques can oftentimes be a great way to kickstart your currency flow in a new league. Of course, everybody knows about item quant, and we've seen already with some of the previews of trinkets that item quant and even augmenting the types of drops that are going to be available in your contracts and in your heists are going to be a big deal. This all means that Magic Find is indeed back on the menu. Of course, I fully plan on seeing a whole bunch of content creators running 6-man parties with all kinds of ridiculous Magic Find boosts and buffs, both to offenses and defenses. But for the average player, I think this is also good news. It means if you didn't have room or didn't have the ability to slot in some additional Magic Find to help boost you as you're playing throughout the game, trinkets are now going to give you a little bit of hopefully an added perk or an added benefit of some additional drops that are going to pay off. It is, after all, an additional item slot dedicated to helping you get more currency and better items to further progress your character. That's pretty great across the board. I simply think that Magic Find characters in and of themselves are going to be, of course, the ones who take top advantage and min-max the advantages that trinkets are going to offer. Our 5th and final prediction is that contracts themselves will be a type of map economy. Now, what do I mean by this? Oftentimes, for those of you who are new to Path of Exile and Path of Exile economics, oftentimes on a league start, the way how many players will make a massive amount of currency to kickstart their league will be to push themselves as hard as they can for the first 12 hours or so of each league to get to maps. Think of it this way. As someone is pushing into maps, if you get into maps and there's a whole slew of players behind you who are just now finishing Act 9 and 10, this means you're going to be able to push into your Atlas and you will have a surplus of maps that you can then sell to those players when they get out of Act 9 and 10. This continues to be the case as you push into yellow maps and then subsequently into red maps. You always have a surplus of maps that you won't necessarily need to be running, and you can sell those to the swaths of players who are only a few minutes maybe behind you in terms of progress, but they're looking to catch up, and they're going to do that by purchasing maps from you. I think that contracts are going to be very similar in this regard. Because contracts are tradable and can be used at all kinds of player levels, expect some players to try to level even primarily through contracts. Now, that's not going to be the case on a first playthrough, but it certainly might be the case for groups to be interacting and using the heist mechanic as often and as early as possible, because players can simply chain contracts back to back to back to back. So once you've knocked out your second Kitava, if you want to just start right away with contracts and farming and heists, that might be a legitimate strategy, and we'll see it emerge. Because contracts are tradable, it also might mean that some players are going to seek to acquire contracts, build up a surplus, like what you do for your Atlas and for maps, and then sell those surplus that you don't want to run to other players who are looking to chain tons and tons of contracts back to back to back to back to eventually earn their heists. Don't be shocked if this also leads to some form of a meta where rushing for level 100 might actually be most efficient by pushing for contracts and by pushing into heists. This might be a prediction that's sure to go wrong. I tell my wife at least once a day, I've been wrong before and I'll be wrong again, and who knows, maybe I'm wrong right now. But it's entirely possible that this could become something of a racing strategy similar to Chayula Breachstones. Players may find out that there's a particular layout or a particular augment or a particular type of contract that is beneficial in terms of XP per hour over a particular map or other endgame style setup. This could mean that contracts at the top end are very, very lucrative, and that the players who first get there and then are able to hoard and control that market will be very, very wealthy for the remainder of the league as they sell off those top tier valuable contracts to other players who are looking to push. Lastly, don't forget that players who are able to push into contracts the hardest and the deepest are also the ones who are able to reach those grand heists faster than other players. So not only is this about essentially a meta developing around simply chaining contracts back to back to back, but it's also about first access to certain types of content, first access to certain types of loot. And as we all know, there's all kinds of loot that is going to be available inside the grand heists that are available in Path of Exile 3.12. So those are a couple of the reasons how I see contracts and maps actually overlapping in terms of their economic value. I see contracts eventually by the end of the league being something that's simply hoarded up in players' stash tabs going, man, we're going to need a stash tab just for contracts if Heist goes core. But without looking too far into the future and seeing the problems of what could come of these contracts, I think it's definitely going to be a Map 2.0 style economy. Well, thanks so much for watching and for joining us for today's discussion with our 5 predictions about the economy in the upcoming 3.12 Heist League. I'd love to read some of your predictions down below, or potentially if you think I'm wrong and any of my predictions are simply way off base, feel free to point those out down below in the comments. I'd love to read those and interact with those. And as always, thanks so much for watching, and I hope this league, 3.12 Heist, is when a Mirror of Calandra drops for you.